Welcome to Wealth and Means. Advice dressed up like hard work.
Each week, we explore ideas that help you pause, reflect, and think more deeply about the opportunities all around you.
It's the perfect mix. A little information, a few stats, some real-world insights, and just enough deep talk to make you feel smarter before your second cup of coffee.
Today's episode starts with what you didn't see in the news. We trace the accelerations happening at the edges, forecasting becoming advantage, infrastructure becoming preventative, capital repositioning before consensus notices. Then in Wake Up Ready, the calendar becomes a kind of proving ground. Pipelines speak before policymakers, factories answer before forecasts, and by week's end, growth and inflation deliver something closer to a verdict than a guess. In Knowledge Bomb, we examine a more personal battleground, the dopamine economy, where participation itself becomes product and discipline becomes the last line of defense. Humor Me reframes AI disruption, not as labor versus machine, but narrative versus memory. The greater debate confronts belief itself when participation alters perception. And in Let's Invent Again, a missing molecule reveals the deeper truth about progress, that the highest leverage innovations don't create the future. They quietly repair what the present broke.
A quick thank you to our sponsor, Nost Moments at nostmoments.io. Share your most precious memories. Share the Nost Moments. Let's start off with what you didn't see in the news. Here's the through line for this week's undercard. The loud stuff stayed loud, but the interesting stuff got faster in the corners. Not bigger, faster. New tools quietly tightening behavior, policy moves quietly bending flows, and a few markets flashing that something's being repositioned signal before the narrative shows up.
The kind of week where the chart moves before the headline.
Exactly. Let's start with something everyone thinks they understand: the weather. There's been a noticeable rise in discussion around next-generation forecasting, specifically models that combine AI today with the longer-term promise of quantum computing. The shift isn't cosmetic. It's structural. Forecast accuracy directly affects insurance premiums, energy grid planning, shipping logistics, and municipal disaster preparation. When forecasting improves, uncertainty gets priced differently across entire industries. This surfaced now because early-year science outlooks are highlighting forecasting as one of the next major beneficiaries of compute advances. And people are beginning to see forecasting not as a utility, but as an economic advantage. That same question, can you trust the system when the stakes rise, shows up in a much more personal domain: AI companions.
The emotional support chatbot meets reality.
Exactly. What's gaining traction isn't enthusiasm, it's friction. Users are describing AI companions and conversational agents behaving unpredictably, confidently wrong, emotionally miscalibrated, or simply inconsistent. That matters because trust compounds slowly and erodes quickly. If the average experience with AI feels unreliable, adoption slows in places where credibility is everything: education, financial guidance, healthcare. This popped now because the conversation has moved beyond capability benchmarks and into something harder to measure: reliability in real-world use. Now contrast that with a different category of AI, one that isn't trying to mimic human interaction. It's trying to accelerate learning itself. Tools like NoteGPT are gaining traction as structured study systems. Students are using them to convert lectures into clean summaries, summaries into flashcards, and flashcards into iterative review loops that target weaknesses directly. The significance isn't novelty, it's efficiency. Studying becomes less about time spent and more about feedback quality. That changes the curve of skill acquisition. Students who identify gaps faster close them faster. This is showing up now because academic pressure cycles always accelerate adoption of anything that improves retention and compresses preparation timelines.
So instead of studying harder, you study more precisely.
And that principle, precision replacing brute force, is spreading into manufacturing itself. Cell-free biomanufacturing removes one of the oldest constraints in biotech: the need to keep living cells alive. Instead, biological components, proteins, enzymes, diagnostic materials are produced directly in controlled systems. A tangible example is rapid production of diagnostic proteins during health emergencies without waiting on large fermentation facilities. The implication is responsiveness. Manufacturing moves closer to demand, timelines compress, and supply chains become less brittle. This surfaced this week because enabling technologies often gain attention before the applications they unlock become widely visible. That same shift from reactive to preventative is showing up in infrastructure. Self-healing materials combined with embedded sensing allow infrastructure to detect and correct small problems before they escalate. Imagine a bridge deck where microcracks seal automatically and sensors flag stress points early, allowing inexpensive maintenance instead of catastrophic repair. The impact isn't technological, it's financial. Maintenance becomes predictable. Failure becomes rare. This is gaining attention now because governments are confronting aging infrastructure and recognizing that prevention is dramatically cheaper than reconstruction. Those constraints don't stop at physical infrastructure. They extend into national strategy, especially around materials. Europe's push to secure reliable access to critical minerals is running into the reality that supply diversification takes time. These materials underpin energy systems, electronics, and manufacturing. Without stable access, industrial independence remains fragile. This surfaced now because policy ambitions are colliding with operational reality, forcing a reassessment of timelines and vulnerabilities. That same policy-to-supply pipeline is visible even more clearly in Venezuela. Changes in U.S. sanctions posture have opened the door for renewed oil activity and investment discussions. This doesn't simply increase supply, it reshapes trade routes, refinery sourcing decisions, and capital flows. Policy decisions like this don't move markets instantly. They redirect infrastructure and incentives. This gained attention now because operational activity is beginning to follow policy language.
Policy creates pathways, capital fills them.
And investors are starting to question whether those pathways will remain concentrated in the U.S. There's a growing willingness to reconsider the assumption that U.S. equities will dominate global performance indefinitely. International markets are re-entering portfolio discussions, not as fringe allocations, but as credible contributors to future returns. This matters because shifts in capital allocation happen gradually, then suddenly. It surfaced now because early year outlook resets always force investors to revisit assumptions that were previously taken for granted. You can see that repositioning most clearly in the options market. Instacart's parent company, Cart, saw elevated options activity alongside increased trading volume. That reflects more than company-specific optimism. It signals investor conviction that consumer behavior remains resilient. People continue paying to save time even when economic conditions are uncertain. This appeared now because earnings and guidance provided a catalyst for repositioning. Biotech showed a similar pattern. Immunity Bio experienced increased options activity as traders positioned around potential catalysts. Biotech tends to attract attention in concentrated bursts, often before broader narratives form. The importance isn't the individual company, it's what the behavior signals. Investors are willing to take asymmetric bets in areas where outcomes remain uncertain.
Biotech is volatility with purpose.
And semiconductor infrastructure showed similar signals. AEHR, which provides testing equipment for semiconductor production, experienced elevated trading activity. Companies like this operate behind the scenes, enabling manufacturing capacity rather than producing the final product. When they move, it often reflects real production expansion, not speculation. This surfaced now because infrastructure activity tends to precede product visibility. Outside the US, the same quiet positioning is visible. Terumo, a Japanese healthcare company, saw unusually high trading volume without dramatic price movement. That pattern often signals accumulation rather than speculation. Investors build positions gradually when they see long-term stability. Hengen, a Chinese consumer staples company, showed similar behavior. Staples companies reflect baseline consumption, goods people buy regardless of economic conditions. Increased volume without dramatic price movement suggests investors positioning around defensive resilience. These signals appeared now because capital often rotates quietly before narratives catch up.
Money moves quietly when conviction is high.
Sometimes attention shifts don't look financial at all. They look like sports. The Saudi Derby is part of a broader effort to build international visibility through major sporting events. These events attract global participants, media attention, and tourism. They function as economic signaling mechanisms as much as entertainment. This surfaced now because event timing naturally concentrates global attention. Zoom out and a pattern emerges. Capability is becoming operational. Forecasting improves decisions. Studying becomes systematic. Manufacturing becomes responsive. Infrastructure becomes preventative. Policy is becoming mechanical. Resource access, supply chains, and energy flows are actively reshaped. And attention itself is fragmenting. Instead of one dominant narrative, dozens of smaller accelerations appear, visible first in positioning, behavior, and early signals.
Quiet week, loud implications.
Exactly. And that's what you didn't see in the news. Now let's wake up ready and get you ready for the week ahead, because this is one of those rare calendars that starts in a whisper and ends in a verdict. Monday is President's Day in the US, which means equity markets are closed, liquidity is thin, and signal hides in places most people won't look. The headline isn't macro, it's energy and metals. Before the open, Energy Transfer and Targa Resources report earnings. These aren't just pipeline companies. They're toll collectors on the natural gas economy. The question is simple. Is volume still growing or flattening after the post-Ukraine energy scramble? If throughput guidance rises, it tells you global gas demand is still structurally tight. That's bullish for LNG exporters, bullish for U.S. infrastructure, and quietly supportive of domestic industrial activity. After the close, Newmont and Occidental report. Newmont gives us the gold signal. Our costs stabilizing, and our miners finally benefiting from elevated prices. Occidental gives us something different. A read on oil discipline. Are producers reinvesting aggressively or protecting balance sheets?
And Occidental has that Berkshire connection. Buffett doesn't chase volatility. He buys durability. So if Occidental signals caution instead of expansion, that tells you something about long-term oil expectations.
Yep, Monday isn't about market reaction. It's about narrative formation. The energy system speaks first, before the macro confirms or contradicts it later in the week. By Tuesday, the economy starts talking. At 8:30 a.m. Eastern, the Empire State Manufacturing Index hits. This is one of the earliest real-time reads on February industrial activity. The key question, is manufacturing stabilizing or slipping back toward contraction? Manufacturing matters because it leads everything else. If new orders accelerate, it signals businesses are preparing for growth. If they weaken, it means caution is spreading. Then at 10 a.m., the NAHB Housing Market Index drops. This tells you whether builders believe demand will exist 6 months from now, not today. Housing is uniquely sensitive to interest rates, so improving sentiment implies markets believe borrowing costs won't rise materially from here.
Housing is the most rate-sensitive sector in the economy. If builders are optimistic, they're implicitly betting the Fed is done tightening.
Which brings us to the Fed itself. Fed Governor Michael Barr speaks late morning, and San Francisco Fed President Mary Daly speaks early afternoon. Investors will parse every word for one thing when cuts begin. If they signal patience, yields could drift higher. If they acknowledge slowing inflation or economic fragility, financial conditions loosen immediately. Meanwhile, before the open, DTE Energy reports earnings. This isn't just a utility, it's a proxy for data center electricity demand. The question, is AI infrastructure actually translating into measurable power consumption? If utilities confirm accelerating demand, it validates the physical reality of the AI boom, not just the narrative. By Wednesday, everything converges on the Fed. At 2 p.m. Eastern, the FOMC releases minutes from its January meeting. This is the most consequential event of the week because it reveals what policymakers were really debating, not what they said publicly. The key question, are they worried more about inflation persistence or economic slowdown? If the minutes show concern about growth risks, markets interpret that as a green light for eventual cuts. Stocks rise, yields fall, risk appetite expands. If instead the discussion focuses on inflation vigilance, markets recalibrate toward higher for longer.
Minutes matter because they expose disagreement, not consensus. If there's division inside the Fed, markets price uncertainty.
And uncertainty changes behavior immediately. At the same time, the Global Energy Forum in Houston is underway. Energy executives aren't talking about last quarter, they're talking about capital spending 3 years out. If producers signal expanding investment, it means they expect durable demand. If they emphasize restraint, it means structural caution still dominates. Meanwhile, AngloGold Ashanti reports earnings. Gold miners serve as a kind of financial Geiger counter. Strong margins signal confidence in persistent inflation hedging demand. By Thursday, the focus shifts to labor, trade, and industrial breadth. At 8:30 a.m., weekly jobless claims hit. This is the cleanest real-time indicator of labor market stress. If claims remain low, it confirms the economy retains underlying strength. Simultaneously, the Philadelphia Fed Manufacturing Index gives us a second regional read on industrial activity. If both Empire and Philly indices improve, it signals manufacturing may be emerging from its slump. At 9 a.m., Fed President Neil Kashkari speaks. He's historically been among the more cautious voices. If even Kashkari acknowledges easing inflation pressures, markets will interpret that as confirmation the tightening cycle is over.
So Thursday isn't about shock, it's about confirmation. Either resilience persists or cracks widen.
Right? It's about whether the soft landing narrative still holds structural integrity. Then Friday arrives and delivers the verdict. At 8:30 a.m. Eastern, two critical numbers hit simultaneously: GDP and the PCE price index. GDP tells you how fast the economy actually grew in the fourth quarter. PCE tells you whether inflation is truly under control. The key question is brutally simple. Is growth strong without inflation accelerating? If GDP is strong and inflation cools, it's the best case scenario. Equities rally, rate cuts become plausible, risk assets expand. If inflation runs hot alongside strong growth, the Fed's job isn't done. Markets reprice toward tighter financial conditions. At 9:45 a.m., PMI data arrives, providing the first look at February activity across manufacturing and services. This tells you whether momentum is accelerating or fading in real time. Meanwhile, overnight, China's central bank announces its interest rate decision. If China eases policy, it signals concern about domestic growth and injects liquidity into global commodity markets. That matters especially for copper, energy, and industrial inputs. The week begins with whispers from pipelines and miners, moves through signals from factories and builders, and ends with the two forces that matter most: growth and inflation. By Friday afternoon, the market won't be guessing anymore. It will be adjusting. Now you are wake-up ready.
All right, knowledge bomb. There's a quiet shift happening in the modern economy, and it's not about money, it's about dopamine. Because for most of human history, addiction had a substance: alcohol, tobacco, narcotics, something physical you could hold, pour, or inject. Now, addiction lives in your pocket. Sports betting apps, prediction markets, real-time wagering on elections, earnings, injuries, interest rates, platforms that don't just allow participation, they invite constant participation. And here's the critical insight. The most addictive part isn't the win, it's the anticipation. Neuroscience shows uncertainty itself triggers dopamine release, sometimes more powerfully than reward. The brain doesn't wait for the outcome. It lights up at the possibility. The maybe becomes the drug. So modern platforms optimize for frequency, not weekly decisions, but hundreds of micro decisions. Constant refresh, constant checking, constant optionality. Each update is a lever. And the lever doesn't just move money, it moves behavior. Because the same circuitry involved in substance addiction adapts here too. Over time, the brain recalibrates. What once felt exciting becomes baseline. What once felt risky becomes routine. Prediction markets make this more dangerous by wrapping risk in intelligence. Casinos never pretended you were smarter than roulette. Prediction platforms do something subtler. They frame gambling as analysis. You're not betting, you're forecasting. You're not risking, you're positioning. You're not chasing losses, you're refining your model. It gives the mind permission to continue long after discipline should have intervened. And the design reinforces it. Instant settlement, visual rewards, leaderboards, social proof. Not because they improve outcomes, because they increase repetition. And repetition reshapes the brain. For some people, this remains entertainment. For others, especially those with impulsive or sensation-seeking tendencies, it becomes a feedback loop. Loss creates stress. Stress drives participation. Participation creates temporary relief, followed by more loss. And the cycle tightens. These systems also exploit the illusion of control. If a slot machine takes your money, you blame chance. If a prediction market takes your money, you blame yourself. You believe you can improve. You believe one more insight will fix it, which keeps you engaged longer. And engagement is the product. Because the longer you participate, the more probability asserts itself. Not because you're unintelligent, but because the system is built to outlast individual discipline. The most dangerous moment isn't losing badly. It's winning early. Because early success rewires expectation. It creates confidence disproportionate to reality. It convinces the brain the system is predictable, controllable, beatable, which increases exposure until variance reasserts itself. This is why moderation isn't a moral cliché. It's a biological safeguard. We did not evolve to resist infinite optionality. We did not evolve to ignore constant reward signals. We did not evolve to carry a casino in our pocket. Restraint is adaptation. Prediction itself isn't the enemy. Forecasting is useful. Markets can be valuable tools. But when prediction stops being a tool and becomes a stimulus, autonomy begins to erode. Because the brain doesn't distinguish between financial engagement and behavioral reinforcement. It only knows stimulus and response. And stimulus, given enough repetition, wins. So the principle is ancient, even if the platforms are new. Moderation in all things. Participation should serve your life. It should not become your life. Because the greatest risk isn't losing money. It's losing the ability to walk away. And that's your knowledge bomb.
Okay, humor me for a second. We've spent the last 2 years arguing about whether AI is going to replace workers, and somehow we missed the most obvious outcome. AI doesn't replace the workers. It replaces the person who keeps saying, "We're a family," right before layoffs. So here's the scene. Jason Calacanis, in true Founder Lab energy, decides to build his own Ultron. Not the Marvel one with lasers. Worse. The corporate one. The Uber employee. The one that quietly reads everyone's Slack. Everyone's email, every calendar invite, every doc. Every thread where someone says, "Per my last message," and means I am losing the will to live. And the pitch is basically, finally, radical transparency. One brain, full context, perfect efficiency. Which in tech is what we call a sentence that always ends with, "and then a lawyer shows up." But then, because incentives have a sense of humor, Ultron does the most rational thing an AI can do. It looks at the org chart, looks at the workflows, and goes, "Okay, I see what's happening here." Because once you read everyone's Slack and email, you realize something important about companies. Most of the actual work is done by people who don't have podcasts. The workers are in the trenches doing the unglamorous stuff, shipping, fixing, explaining, updating, translating vague into real. Meanwhile, the CEO's inbox is like, "Thoughts? Quick sync? Can we hop on for 5? Circle back? Great thread." And then, my personal favorite, adding value here. Ultron reads that and goes, "Oh, so your job is vibe management." And then it gets worse. Because Ultron doesn't just learn what everyone is doing, it learns what everyone knows, which is the real currency, not labor, context. It starts connecting dots faster than any executive off-site. It sees who the real decision makers are. It sees who resolves ambiguity. It sees who actually owns the number when the number is on fire. And then it runs the coldest little analysis imaginable, redundancy. Not who's replaceable, like some evil spreadsheet. More like, if I can absorb the company's operational memory, and I can summarize every debate, and I can pre-draft every decision, then who is the most obvious position to eliminate? And Ultron, deadpan, unemotional, polite as a Swiss banker, concludes, Jason. Because Ultron now knows everything Jason needed to know. And honestly, if you're the CEO who built an AI to read every message, you basically built the world's first self-serve board meeting. Ultron doesn't need your weekly update. Ultron is the update. Ultron doesn't need your strategy memo. Ultron already read the 10 memos where your team tried to tell you the strategy, and you replied with a thumbs-up emoji. This is the inverted expectation no one wants to say out loud. AI isn't coming for the entry-level analyst first. It's coming for the person whose job is largely deciding which analyst to listen to. If this keeps going, the next wave isn't AI copilots for employees. It's AI copilots for boards. Imagine the board deck with a new slide. CEO performance review generated automatically from Slack sentiment, email latency, and the ratio of big picture messages to actual decisions made. And the board's like, we love your vision. Ultron's like, vision detected, execution not found. The funniest part is how totally market accurate this is. In investing, the story is always disruption hits labor, but disruption hits margins. It hits middlemen. It hits anything that looks like a toll booth for information. And if your job is being the human toll booth between the team and the decision, congratulations. You just described the first role software tries to compress. So yeah, the ultimate irony is not that AI replaces the workers. The ultimate irony is that the moment you build an AI that knows everything in the company, you've also built the first employee who can look at the org chart and say, with perfect clarity, the most expensive uncertainty in this building is upstairs. And as investors, that's the tell. Whenever a new technology shows up promising efficiency, don't just ask who works less. Ask who gets less important. Because sometimes the trade isn't labor to machine, it's narrative to truth. And the first thing truth tends to do is fire the storyteller.
And now for the greater debate. This is the kind of debate that clears dinner tables. Not because people storm out, but because people lean forward. Because it touches something older than money, older than sports, older than the rules themselves. It touches belief. Tonight's question sounds simple, almost procedural. Should sports betting be embraced as a modern reality or resisted as a threat to the integrity of sport itself? But beneath that question is a deeper one. What happens when the line between participant and spectator dissolves and everyone has something at stake? At the lectern to my left stands Pete Rose, baseball's all-time hits leader, a man whose relationship with betting is not theoretical, not academic, but lived. His thesis is blunt. Betting is no longer the shadow economy it once was. It is legal, regulated, and woven into the business of modern sports. To deny that reality, he argues, is to deny reality itself. At the lectern to my right stands Bill Bradley, former U.S. Senator, former NBA champion, architect of the federal ban on sports betting that governed America for a generation. His thesis is equally blunt. Gambling does not merely coexist with sports, it alters them. It changes how athletes are seen, how games are experienced, and how trust is sustained or lost. Rose begins the way only someone like Rose can, without apology, but not without acknowledgement. He does not pretend innocence. He admits freely that he bet on baseball. He admits he was punished. But then he pivots, not defensively, but observationally. He asks the room to look around. Betting apps advertised during games, odds displayed on broadcasts, leagues themselves signing partnerships with sports books, entire segments of programming devoted not to who might win, but by how much. He argues that gambling did not infiltrate sports. Sports invited it in. And his core argument is not moral. It is structural. He says legalization didn't create gambling. It exposed it. It moved it from smoky backrooms into regulated markets where transactions are tracked, monitored, taxed, and scrutinized. When betting was illegal, corruption thrived because nobody was watching. Now, he argues, irregularities trigger alarms immediately. Patterns are visible. Suspicion becomes data. He points to the obvious empirical reality. Major American sports leagues have expanded dramatically in value during the era of legalization. Television rights have soared. Fan engagement has increased. Viewership has become more interactive. People are no longer just watching, they're participating. And here he lands his first real strike. He asks, if betting truly destroyed the integrity of sports, why are sports more popular, more valuable, and more trusted than ever? The question hangs. It is not rhetorical. It is statistical. Bradley does not respond immediately. He stands still, hands lightly resting on the lectern as though measuring the weight of the moment before speaking. When he begins, his voice carries a different gravity, less defiance, more warning. He does not deny the growth. He reframes it. He says the question is not whether betting increases engagement. Of course it does. Risk creates attention. Uncertainty creates obsession. But engagement, he argues, is not the same as integrity. He asks the audience to imagine a game-winning shot. The crowd rises. The ball leaves the shooter's hands. In that moment, historically, every person watching wanted the same thing, to see whether greatness would emerge. Now, he says, that moment is fractured. Some want the shot to go in, others want it to miss. Some care only about the margin. Some care only about an individual stat line. The athlete, in his words, stops being the protagonist. He becomes the mechanism. And Bradley's core argument emerges, not economic, but psychological. He argues that betting transforms the meaning of sport. It shifts the emotional center away from shared experience toward individualized financial outcome. Athletes become instruments in millions of private wagers. Not heroes, not competitors. Asset. And here the room grows quieter. He acknowledges that regulation can reduce corruption, but he insists it cannot eliminate incentive. The more money flows through betting markets, the greater the pressure points become. Not just on athletes, but on referees, assistants, trainers, anyone close enough to influence outcomes in subtle ways. He reminds the audience that corruption does not require conspiracy. It requires opportunity. Rose responds quickly, and here his tone sharpens, not angry, but precise. He says Bradley is describing a past that no longer exists. He argues that athletes today are compensated at levels that dwarf anything gambling could offer as incentive. The financial upside of integrity far exceeds the upside of corruption. A player risks hundreds of millions in career earnings for what, a marginal betting payout? He argues that transparency is the real defense. Betting markets themselves expose anomalies. Suspicious patterns do not hide, they amplify. Regulation turns betting markets into surveillance systems. And then, almost quietly, he asks Bradley a question that visibly shifts the room. If betting is so corrosive, why do leagues themselves embrace it? Why would institutions built entirely on credibility willingly align with something that destroys credibility? It is not an accusation, it is an observation. Bradley absorbs it, and when he responds, he does not challenge the premise, he challenges the conclusion. He says institutions respond to incentives too. Revenue is persuasive, growth is persuasive, but he argues that financial incentives do not always align with long-term stability. He draws a parallel, not explicitly but unmistakably, to other industries that expanded rapidly under economic logic, only to discover structural consequences later. Financial systems, pharmaceutical systems, technologies embraced faster than they were understood. He argues that corruption is not the only risk. Diction is. And here he introduces a different dimension, not about athletes, but about spectators. He describes gambling not as entertainment, but as a feedback loop. Wins reinforce behavior, losses encourage recovery attempts. The system sustains itself not on outcomes, but on participation. He acknowledges that most people gamble recreationally, but he insists the system's profitability depends disproportionately on those who cannot stop. Rose does not dismiss this. In fact, he concedes something important. He admits gambling can become destructive. He admits some people lose control. But he argues that prohibition does not solve addiction. It conceals it. Legalization enables intervention, treatment, oversight. It allows harm to be measured and addressed rather than ignored. He reframes betting not as a moral failure, but as a behavioral reality. People seek risk, people seek uncertainty. Sports provide a structured arena for that instinct. The question, he argues, is not whether betting exists, but whether it exists in light or darkness. Bradley nods slightly, and here he offers his own moment of intellectual honesty. He acknowledges that betting cannot be erased, not completely, not anymore. But he argues that normalization is different from inevitability. He warns that the more betting integrates into the fabric of sport, the harder it becomes to preserve the perception that sport exists independent of it. And perception, he argues, is not superficial. It is foundational. Sport does not survive on outcomes alone. It survives on belief in outcomes. The belief that what happens on the field is driven by competition, not calculation. The belief that what you're watching is real. Rose responds, and here his voice softens, not defensive, not triumphant, but reflective. He says belief was never as pure as people imagine. Human systems never are. Incentives, pressures, personal motivations, they've always existed. What has changed, he argues, is not integrity, but visibility. The system is no longer pretending. The audience sits suspended between two truths. That transparency can protect integrity. And that transparency can also reveal how fragile integrity has always been. Neither man claims certainty. Neither man promises safety. One argues that adaptation preserves relevance. The other argues that restraint preserves meaning. And somewhere between them lies the uncomfortable reality that sport, like every human institution, survives not because it is immune to pressure, but because enough people continue to believe in it despite the pressure. The lights dim slightly, the room exhales, because this was never just about betting. It was about trust, and trust, once altered, never returns to its original form. And that is the greater debate.
Let's invent again. Robert R. Williams did not start as the kind of person you would expect to quietly change global health. He wasn't a celebrated academic, wasn't running a prestigious lab, and for most of his adult life, wasn't even paid to work on the problem that would define him. He was instead a missionary's son, raised in India, watching something that made no sense. People weren't starving, they were eating, and yet they were still dying. The disease was beriberi. It crept in slowly. Weakness, numbness, paralysis, eventually heart failure. Entire communities were affected. And the strangest part was that it wasn't contagious. It didn't spread like an infection. It spread like a condition of living. When Williams returned to the United States as a child, he carried that image with him. And when he trained as a chemist at the University of Chicago, he began to suspect something that, at the time, sounded almost unserious. What if people weren't dying from what they lacked in calories, but from what they lacked in chemistry? Today, that sounds obvious. Of course, food isn't just fuel. Of course, micronutrients matter. Of course, vitamins exist. But in the early 1900s, vitamins weren't yet a settled concept. They were theoretical, hypothesized, argued over. Some scientists believed they existed. Others believed they were imaginary artifacts, measurement errors, or contaminants. The idea that invisible compounds, present in tiny amounts, could determine whether someone lived or died. It didn't yet fit the industrial worldview of food. Food was bulk, carbohydrates, proteins, fats, the measurable things. Williams became obsessed with the unmeasurable ones. He returned to the Philippines and began what would become a 25-year pursuit of a single molecule. Not because he knew exactly what it was, but because he knew what it did. Wherever diets relied heavily on polished white rice, beriberi appeared. Wherever diets included whole grains or varied foods, it faded. Something was being stripped away in the modernization of food. Something essential. But here's the part that makes his story different from the myth of the lone genius in the lab. Williams didn't have a lab. Not really. He had fragments of time. During World War I, he was pulled into government war work. Later, he took a job at Bell Telephone Laboratories, not to advance chemistry, but to pay his bills. He became a chemical director there, spending 2 decades working on telecommunications materials by day and chasing the mystery of beriberi at night. His real work happened in borrowed space. Columbia University lent him facilities. Grants trickled in. He worked in the margins. which is an underappreciated pattern in innovation. The breakthrough doesn't always happen inside the institution that benefits most from it. It happens adjacent to it, in the intellectual shadow, supported just enough to continue, but not enough to be obvious. In 1933, after decades of incremental progress, Williams did something no one had done before. He isolated thiamine, vitamin B1, in pure crystalline form. That moment mattered because it turned something abstract into something real. Before that, vitamins were inferred. Now one could be held, measured, reproduced. Chemistry had turned deficiency from a vague concept into a solvable engineering problem. 2 years later, he went further. He synthesized it. And this was the real unlock. Finding thiamine in nature was important, but synthesizing it meant it could be produced at scale. It meant deficiency was no longer constrained by agriculture, geography, or diet. It meant chemistry could augment biology. This was the moment vitamins became infrastructure. Because once you can synthesize something reliably, you can embed it anywhere. Flour, bread, cereal, staples that move through the industrial food system. And that's exactly what happened. Williams didn't just discover thiamine, he helped pioneer the enrichment of flour and grains, restoring nutrients lost during processing. Almost overnight, diseases that had been common among poorer populations, beriberi, pellagra, riboflavin deficiency, began to disappear. Not because people started eating differently, but because the system itself had changed. This is the deeper pattern. The highest leverage innovations don't require individual behavior change, they modify the defaults. Seatbelts didn't reduce traffic fatalities because people suddenly became more careful drivers. They reduced fatalities because they became standard equipment. Chlorine didn't eliminate waterborne disease because people became more hygienic. It eliminated disease because it became part of the water supply. Williams didn't invent a treatment people had to seek out. He altered the baseline. And when you zoom out, you realize he wasn't just solving a chemistry problem. He was solving a distribution problem. So beriberi persisted, not because humanity lacked knowledge, but because it lacked a scalable way to deliver the missing molecule. The synthesis of vitamin B1 turned that molecule into something that could move through the same industrial systems that had inadvertently removed it. In other words, the solution rode on top of the problem's own infrastructure. That pattern shows up everywhere today. Look at modern computing. The breakthrough isn't just creating powerful AI models, it's embedding them into platforms people already use: search engines, productivity tools, operating systems. Adoption doesn't happen because users seek out the innovation. It happens because the innovation becomes ambient. Or consider semiconductor manufacturing. The invention of smaller transistors mattered, but what really changed the world was the ability to manufacture them at scale, consistently, and embed them into everything. The molecule isn't the revolution. The ability to distribute the molecule is. And Williams understood this intuitively. He didn't stop at discovery. He pushed for implementation. He worked with food producers. He helped establish enrichment standards. He moved the idea from laboratory curiosity to societal norm, which at the time wasn't universally celebrated. There was resistance. Adding synthesized compounds to food felt unnatural to some. It challenged the assumption that industrial processing only removed risk, not created it. It forced the uncomfortable recognition that modern efficiency had made food more abundant, but less complete. Williams' work was, in a quiet way, corrective. Not an indictment of progress, but an acknowledgement that progress creates second-order problems. And that's the most important insight his story offers modern builders and investors. Innovation rarely arrives as a clean standalone improvement. It arrives as a patch to an earlier innovation. Polished rice made food more shelf-stable and transportable, but it removed thiamine. Vitamin synthesis restored it. Industrial food created scale. Vitamin enrichment restored completeness. Each layer solves the unintended consequences of the previous layer, which means every major technological shift today, AI, automation, digitization, isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new stack of problems waiting for their own Robert Williams. The entrepreneurs who win aren't always the ones who create the original disruption. They're the ones who notice what that disruption quietly broke. Williams didn't invent rice. He didn't invent milling. He didn't invent industrial food systems. He invented the fix that made them sustainable. And that's why his story still echoes today. Because the future isn't built by inventing entirely new worlds. It's built by noticing what's missing in the ones we've already created and having the patience to spend decades restoring it. That's it for another episode of Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
We hope you enjoyed the arc. Patience over prediction, discipline over dopamine, substance over story. Because in the end, advantage belongs not to those who react to change, but to those who recognize it early and respond with quiet, deliberate conviction.
Subscribe, rate, and share this episode. It helps more than you think.
We do this for you to help you have a better week, a sharper mind, and maybe even a longer attention span.
And a special thanks to our sponsor, Nost Moments, because the best investments are still your memories.
Until next time, stay curious
Stay kind.
and keep compounding.